You just spent some time hearing from classmates about the responses to the warm-up questions that you see here. Each of these statements are related to deeper learning in some way. So let's now learn a bit more by what we mean when we say deeper learning. You've probably seen this in a lot of your classrooms. Teachers write an objective on the board each day or each week. Let's first talk about what these objectives mean. Objectives are what students should be able to do at the end of a lesson or learning exercise. The objective here says, today I will understand the 5 main elements of plot by completing notes and identifying the elements using a mentor text. This is a typical objective in an English class. The teacher hopes that by the end of this lesson or unit, this student is able to do this, and they'll usually give them a test in order to see whether or not they can. At LPS, sometimes we call these learning targets. Objectives differ by subject and can be completed in an hour or may take several days. Objectives can be used to achieve different levels of learning. Let's talk a bit about what I mean by different levels of learning. Look at this simple image. It's showing different levels of learning by asking some really basic questions. Questions like what, when, and where are lower levels of learning. It's also called comprehension. A bit above that is the question how. This is a higher level of thinking that requires that you ask a question to understand how something happened. And above that is the question why, which is a higher level of learning that asks you to understand why something happens. Let's look at some objectives for each of these levels. For what, when, and where, an objective might be around knowing the name and dates of a war, or the order of events, or to divine the meaning of a word, or describe what's happening in a story. These are things you might do at the beginning of a unit, or when you're first being introduced to a skill. It makes sense to have a lower level of learning when you're first learning something brand new. In the second level, the objectives might be a bit more complex. Instead of naming the dates of a war, you might describe the strategies of two different groups. Or instead of knowing the order of events, you might explain a process and how it works. Instead of defining the meaning of a word, you might use a new word correctly in an essay. Or instead of describing just what's happening in a story, you might actually start asking questions about a story. At an even higher level of learning, objectives might sound like this. Instead of just describing the strategies of two groups, you may evaluate which strategy was best. Or rather than explaining a process, you may create a new process. Instead of using a new word correctly in an essay, you might be able to analyze the use of a word by an author. And instead of just asking questions about a story, you may create a story of your own using specific techniques. As you can see here, there are different levels of learning, and while this is a simplified image, it helps you see that your teachers choose different objectives based on what level of learning they want you to achieve. In our typical classes that were 60 minutes, we often were here. You were being introduced to an idea, but by the time you were able to get to the how and why, time was up, and you might come back the next day not remembering everything you needed the day before. It can be hard to start at a higher level of learning. Although many of our teachers shoot for the how and why, it can be difficult without enough time. This year, we have block classes on Tuesday, Wednesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays, and we have 100 minutes. In those 100-minute classes, our teachers are going to try to bring you through a process of a variety of different learning levels, allowing you to access higher levels of learning, asking the questions like how and why. So what might this actually look like in a 100-minute class? Well, we're trying to figure that out. Typically, you may have discussions with classmates in small groups. You may have time to do close readings that are dissected and discussed. You may have reflections that include writing and think time, or group work that may require multiple steps and reflections. Some teachers may be able to do long-term projects that require collaboration, or time to provide feedback to classmates about their writing, thinking, or assessment. As we explore deeper learning this year in your 100-minute classes, we're going to learn more about what it takes to get to those higher levels of learning. Sometimes this may be challenging. However, we're going to rely on Conley's research, which tomorrow you'll learn more about the ACT section, about techniques and learning skills you can use to get to those higher levels of deeper learning. Now, you're going to reflect on some final questions on the next page, and then put your Chrome at 45 degrees and wait for your advisor.